In this section, I'm going to introduce you to a construct called self-compassion that was developed by Kristin Neff from the University of Texas, Austin. Self-compassion is really an answer to some of the age-old tenets that inform human civilization. And I'll explain what these tenets are and why self-compassion is sort of an anecdote to them. So going back to Greek and Roman thinkers, one of the ideas about happiness was that it was a function of virtue. You may be familiar with the self-harshness, guilt, and self-flagellation were considered the main ways to achieve happiness, which we actually didn't get to arrive at until the afterlife. So happiness is viewed as it's a kind of duty, a pain to self, sacrifice kind of way of thinking. A construct that is related to that is the idea of martyrdom. And why martyrdom? Well, martyrs in many philosophies and religious or historic traditions, spiritual traditions, are considered the holy examples of ideal leaders. So again, these faith traditions are espousing the notion that you have to suffer, that you have to kind of criticize yourself and your own existence and make big sacrifices in order to be happy. There is a classic idea that mistakes are often that we call sin require punishment. And in children, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So there is a good reason to physically punish and punish in a way, in different ways, people who are making mistakes. So this interestingly often comes from ourselves. You will hear about this from Dr. Kristin Neff herself as she elaborates on how this works on the next few videos. We often are much harsher in judging ourselves and our own mistakes than we would be with anyone else. Another idea that kind of brings up this notion that we should be really critical and we should be driven just by the fear of punishment is a sort of strict visioning of natural selection. The idea that less than fittest is going to fail, and if you are not the fittest, you are a failure. And in a more morbid narrative, the less than fittest dies. So letting that idea that you have to be the best in every walk of life, in every pursuit you make in order to be considered worth living, is something that informs a habit of thinking. Coming from psychology, we have a Freudian tradition. Freud did many wonderful things for expanding a way of thinking about our mental life, but one thing he did that sometimes can be problematic is that he sort of suggests that humans are all driven by this sort of selfish, destructive, aggressive impulses that need to be firmly controlled. So this idea that we use a lot of Freudian languages throughout life in ways that maybe we don't really think about the origins of it. There's another tradition from psychology that sort of infuses modern thinking about self in this way is behaviorism. So behaviorism was a decades-long tradition where ideas about the mind and mental life were really relegated to punishment and reward. The bad behavior, we didn't care what they were or what they came from, but rather all we need to do is punish the undesired behaviors. So if we think through this kind of space, it is kind of dismal. The way that we can imagine trying to pursue things and taking risk and failing at life, it feels kind of heartbreaking when we think about this sort of underpinning from our culture. The science of self-esteem is really interesting and important way to think about how we view ourselves, because self-esteem sort of suggests that to consider yourself valuable in the world, you have to be better than average. That's great. That's great. Well, except that if everybody's aspiring for that and everybody is better than average, we are in a place of mathematical implausibility. It's statistically impossible for everybody to be better than average. In some cases, and Kristen Neff again will sort of discuss this, it's okay to be average and to let yourself be average and to comfort yourself in trying new things that which you'll be average. This sort of more anthropological evolutionary idea that fierce competition as a result of our shift from a nomadic society to being an agricultural society is the route to success. That's what we have had to do in order to survive as a species. And there's plenty of ideas actually that are currently challenging that notion that fierce competition is a way for a species, particularly human species, to succeed. In fact, it looks more like cooperation and working in these collectives is something that has been instrumental to the success of our species. Again, well, responding to these ways that we are kind of developed a notion of who we are and why we are here and what we are capable of in our kind of Western individualistic mind frame, Kristen Neff came out and said, well, hey, wait a minute. Why don't we be much kinder and gentler to ourselves? Why don't we give ourselves a cushion? So, self-compassion, Kristen defines as a practice of quitting the inner critic, replacing it with a voice of support, understanding, and care for one's self. And again, one thing that I like which Kristen does is ask you to reflect on a time that you have made a mistake versus a time that someone you care deeply about has made a mistake and what kind of things you say in both of these contexts. Most of us go to the other person, well, I'm really sorry that's a bummer. It's gonna be okay. I know you're going through this and you will be successful the next time. Don't you worry. And this is what we tell to others, right? And with ourselves, we are much more harsher and we are much more critical. And in fact, often our mistakes leave us paralyzed against trying things in the future that are risky. Kristen's going to elaborate and walk you through three main components of self-compassion. She defines them as self-kindness, a sense of common humanity, or being connected to other people, or feeling interdependent, and not surprisingly, also an element of mindfulness, being willing to relate to moments in a kind and discerning and non-judgmental way. So let's stay tuned for the next few videos and articles by Kristen Neff, the founder herself, in fleshing out the ideas of self-compassion and its role in happiness. Let's enjoy her soothing voice.